Kate Bowler is one of these amazing writers that I was introduced to a few years ago. She wrote this book, Everything Happens for a Reason, and Other Lies I've Loved. And then this wonderful book that came out, I think just last year or the year before. It's called No Cure for Being Human and Other Truths I Need to Hear. So Kate really writes from this space of in between. So a little bit about Kate Bowler. She is a professor of American Religious Studies at Duke. She's Canadian. And in her mid-30s, she was diagnosed with stage 4 colorectal cancer. And she has a son, a young son. And as she was journeying through that process of staring death in the face, she wrote a lot of wisdom in these 2 books. So I would highly recommend picking these up and reading them. But one story that I want to share with you today is one in which she decides to go on a pilgrimage with her family, a pilgrimage to the Grand Canyon. And as she is going on this trip, they're just off of Route 66, and she sees this tiny cathedral, so they pull over. And it is surrounded, this tiny chapel, it's surrounded by ponderosa pine. There's no town for miles, and so she's really curious about this little church that she has found. And so she tries the doors. She finds them unlocked, and she tentatively walks inside. And she writes, "The room was a miniature sanctuary, unheated and inelegant. The floor was loose gravel, and someone had nailed together some benches to face a chunk of stone serving as an altar. But the light of the setting sun, an incandescent orange, poured through the windows and lit up the walls, which were covered with graffiti, both fresh and faded. I ran my fingers along the black ink, covering the altar and the pen marks, gouging the soft wooden walls. Almost every inch of it was covered with words. I miss you every day. Please let my daughter be the way she was before. Did you make it to heaven, my love? Helen, I am weak, but you already knew that." I looked up. Hundreds of slips of paper were stuffed into the rafters and seams in the wall. All the people who have fallen into the cracks in the universe, undone by the smallest tragedies. We try to outsmart our limitations and our bad luck, but here we are, shouting the truth into the abyss. There is no cure for being human. Someone had built a monument to the void, and it was full to the brim. I heard the door creak open behind me, and Tobin's face peeked through, her husband. "Hello," he called tentatively. "Oh, hello," I said, popping my head above a pew. I was lying on my back along one of the benches, looking up at the messages scrawled on the ceiling. Tobin sat down beside me, and he placed a gentle hand on my head. He tipped his head up, taking in the ceiling, neither of us speaking. And he said, "I used to think we were the only ones." "Me too," I agree. We all live like this, without assurances, without formulas, desperate for the secret to carrying on. "Do you think anyone would mind if I added a little something?" I asked quickly. Tobin raised an eyebrow, and he gestured to the chaotic scrawl around us. "A moment of privacy then, sir," I answered with a smile, tearing a strip out of my notebook and taking out a pen. I wrote down a phrase, got up on the bench, and stuffed the slip of paper in the wall as high as I could reach. "What did you decide?" he wondered when we climbed back into the truck. "It was something that one of my teachers used to say," I replied. I love thinking about him at the chalkboard, goading us into advanced math problems as he publicly suffered under the disease infecting all good teachers, too much faith in humanity. "Dum spiro spero," he would say, shaking his head. "While I breathe, I hope." This week, our stories were 2 that are about hope, right? They're about new life. We heard the story from Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, in chapter 37, in which God speaks out, saying to these bones that are lying all over, he looks at Ezekiel and he says, "Can these bones live?" this valley of dry bones, can these bones live? And Ezekiel prophesies, and the bones come back together, and God breathes into them, and new life comes from that moment. The other story we heard was about Lazarus. This famous story that we find in John 11, in which Jesus' friend Lazarus is sick. And his sisters Martha and Mary send word to Jesus, but Jesus doesn't come right away. Jesus doesn't come to heal his friend, even though he knows what is going to happen. Jesus' timing is late. And so Lazarus dies. And then Jesus comes. Jesus comes and he hears that his friend has died, and he sees his sisters who are crying, weeping, and Jesus weeps too. And then Jesus goes to the tomb and he tells them to roll away the stone, and he calls out for Lazarus. Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus comes out in all of the binding that had happened from the funeral, from the death. And Jesus tells his neighbors, his friends, his loved ones to unbind him. See, those situations don't happen in real life, do they? Oftentimes we're confronted with more death than we seem to pay attention to life. It feels like there is just despair and heartache all around us, and we wonder, can these bones live? Can we actually find hope in the midst of so much pain, so much heartache, so much despair? Reminds me of this little trick that you do when you're playing sports, or when you're cooking, or when you're doing something as simple as writing, right? The first time you try that, the first time you try to write, the first time you try to dribble a basketball, the first time you try to chop an onion, it's really hard. It feels really awkward, right? But the more that we practice, the more that you practice dribbling, you actually become pretty good with it and pretty familiar with it. And you're able to maybe dribble in between your legs, dribble behind your back, do some really cool tricks, run while you're dribbling. It's the same with writing, right? It's just pretty soon as you practice and practice and practice, that muscle memory just takes over. Pretty soon you're writing without even thinking about it, or chopping an onion, or doing whatever. It makes me feel like this is a moment that Jesus gives for muscle memory, right? This is almost a precursor, a warm-up for what is about to come for Jesus. So the disciples are there when Lazarus has died. The disciples are there, they see Jesus weep. The disciples are there and they experience the rolling away of the stone and Lazarus coming out with the binding all over him. The disciples are there. They witness this miracle, this resurrection miracle. And just a short while later, they're going to encounter Jesus' death. It's almost like Jesus is preparing them for a possibility, for hope in the midst of despair. It's hard to hope sometimes. It's really hard for us to hold on to hope. And we get a lot of practice at it. We get a lot of practice of crying out to God, can these bones live? We get a lot of practice out of crying out for Jesus to come immediately, come and heal, come and rescue. But a lot of times, God's timing is not our own. And Jesus is late. And we don't get the miracle that we'd hoped for. Maybe we don't get the healing. Maybe we still end up losing our job, our marriage. Maybe we still feel isolated and alone, or still are confronted with that addiction or stress or grief. What is it in you that feels like dry bones? Like you just cannot go on anymore? That there is nothing here but death, and there's no way that God can bring new life from this moment. We're about to enter this season of spring. It's a season that screams of possibilities of new life. See, already in my yard, I'm starting to see my irises pop up. What was bare dirt a week ago, it now has new life. The grass in my yard that has been browned and yellowed from the winter snow that has been on it all winter long, it's now starting to have a tint of beautiful green. And I think that God gives us this visual every year of this new life that can't help but spring forth, this new life that shows us beauty and possibility. I think God gives us this example every year because it is easy to forget. It's easy to look around and only see the barren landscape or the browns and remember what once was, but forget that God, of all things, with God, all things are possible. With God, there is always a possibility for abundant life, and that is always within reach for us. So as we begin to see this season go from winter to spring, from barren to beautiful, let us reactivate that muscle memory within each of us. Let us again remember what it is to have hope of new life, hope of new beginning. Not hope in that things will be exactly as they were and better, but a new start, because things will never be the same. But that doesn't mean that new life cannot spring up. So let us hold on to that muscle memory. While we still breathe, let us hold on to hope.